the question of the pupil. You have suggested that Ouspensky recorded in his book In Search of the Miraculous very exactly what Gurdjieff told him, and yet did not use these quotes for his, that is to say, Ouspensky's teaching. This sounds rather strange and difficult to take in. Could you give us examples of this? The teacher replies, for a considerable length of time now, measured in decades, I would suggest, I have been giving examples to show this. So let us take two which deal with the main core elements of the Gurdjieff tradition, that is to say, this teaching coming from Ouspensky, but attributed to Gurdjieff. And these concern self-remembering, the idea of self-remembering, and the idea of negative emotions. Ouspensky is recorded in the book The Fourth Way as saying that there are the two most important elements of his teaching are the teaching on consciousness, which in Ouspensky's actual teaching we understand as self-remembering, the ability to remember ourselves, or at least this is a part of the teaching on consciousness. And the second most important element in Ouspensky's teaching is negative emotions. So I'll take these two elements, self-remembering and negative emotions. I've spoken about these so many times before. You can perhaps go back to those talks, but let me briefly answer your question. And the first concerns self-remembering. And the idea in the Gurdjieff tradition is that self-remembering is a quality, I suggest, that we can develop in ourselves. We are trying to remember ourselves with the idea, and this is where Ouspensky is false, as misunderstood Gurdjieff, with the idea that self-remembering is something that we can develop in us, like a muscle that will get stronger the more we try it. And so we are trying to remember ourselves to arrive eventually at a point where we can actually remember ourselves. But of course this is not what Gurdjieff said. Gurdjieff initially suggested try to remember yourself, try to be present in your observations, and so on. Of course, so that we would come to the conclusion, and this is Gurdjieff's teaching, that we can't do it. And then Gurdjieff added this, which is recorded very exactly by Ouspensky. Gurdjieff said, we come to the conclusion that we must remember ourselves. How do we come to this conclusion? We come to this conclusion because for a limited and supervised period, we try to remember ourselves, coming to the conclusion we can't do it, but we should be able to do it. And Gurdjieff says we come to the conclusion that we must remember ourselves, recorded by Ouspensky very exactly. But, Gurdjieff goes on to say, the next phase of the teaching, but in order to remember ourselves, we must have in ourselves the energies for self-remembering. So this is recorded very exactly, and this is what your question is about, and this is what I've said. Ouspensky, very exact, this is what Gurdjieff said. But Gurdjieff is not saying anything about self-remembering. He's saying we come to the conclusion that we must remember ourselves, but in order to remember ourselves, we must have in ourselves the energies for self-remembering. So Gurdjieff is talking about the energies for self-remembering. And what Gurdjieff's teaching is that self-remembering is a quality that the normal man should have. That is to say, it is a quality already in us, but which doesn't manifest in us. So we are not normal, we are abnormal. We are ordinary men and women. We cannot remember ourselves because we don't have in ourselves the energies for self-remembering. So Gurdjieff's teaching is about the energies for self-remembering, which I suggest is quite different from a teaching that says we must try to remember ourselves, a teaching about self-remembering. Gurdjieff was not teaching about self-remembering. He was teaching that we can't remember ourselves as we are, because we are ordinary, because we are abnormal. We should be able to remember ourselves, that is to say, if we were normal, we would be able to remember ourselves. So why can't we remember ourselves as ordinary, abnormal people? Because we don't have the energies for self-remembering. Self-remembering is a quality in us already, which does not manifest in us as ordinary men and women because we don't have the energies for self-remembering. So Gurdjieff's teaching is about the energies for self-remembering, which I suggest is a quite different topic to the idea that we must try to develop in ourselves self-remembering. So until you see that distinction, you can't distinguish between the Gurdjieff tradition, coming from Ouspensky, but attributed to Gurdjieff, a teaching on self-remembering. You can't distinguish that from Gurdjieff's actual teaching, which is a teaching about energies. The fact that we already have, as normal men and women, self-remembering, or we should have self-remembering, but we don't have it because we don't have the energies for it. It doesn't manifest in us because we don't have the energies. So Gurdjieff is teaching about the energies for self-remembering. Completely different subject. So the second most important element in Ouspensky's teaching is the teaching on negative emotions. Well, Gurdjieff never, as far as I know, said anything about negative emotions. And we look for the exact quote that Ouspensky records Gurdjieff having said. What's the exact quote? Because your question is about this situation. Ouspensky records very exactly what Gurdjieff said, but then goes off on a tangent, interpreting it in his own way. So there's a very exact statement that Gurdjieff has given, Ouspensky has recorded it, and then Ouspensky himself creates, and quite openly, if we look at the first part of the book The Fourth Way, Ouspensky's own teaching in London, Ouspensky quite openly creates out of that a completely different teaching, a teaching on negative emotions. So what does Gurdjieff actually say? Gurdjieff says, and Ouspensky records this, you can try to, so it's a try to exercise, temporary supervised task, try to do something to come to the realization that you actually can't do it as an ordinary man or woman. We should be able to do these things, but we can't. Try to exercise. Try to struggle. So it's a struggle. But what with? And Gurdjieff says, recorded by Ouspensky, try to struggle with a habit. So it's a struggle with a habit. What is the habit? Try to struggle with the habit of immediately expressing yourself or manifesting. It's a habit of immediately manifesting. And when do we have this habit of immediately manifesting? When we experience an unpleasant emotion. So we can try to struggle with a habit of immediately expressing ourselves when we experience an unpleasant emotion. So again, Ouspensky takes from this and creates a teaching on negative emotions. Well, first of all, we can try to struggle with a habit. It's not about the emotions. It's about struggling with a habit. Completely different centre. It's not about negativity. There are no negative emotions. We can try to struggle with a habit of immediately expressing ourselves or manifesting when we experience an unpleasant emotion. Because the emotional centre, Gurdjieff has said, recorded by Ouspensky, is divided into pleasant and unpleasant emotions, and not positive and negative emotions. So again, an example where when you actually look at what Gurdjieff said, recorded brilliantly by Ouspensky, I must admit, it's Ouspensky the journalist, and compare it to what Ouspensky actually was teaching in London from 1921 to 1941, we find that Ouspensky has misinterpreted and misunderstood Gurdjieff at every turn and created a completely different teaching, which I call the Gurdjieff tradition, because this teaching has become associated with Gurdjieff, as if this teaching of Ouspensky is Gurdjieff's teaching. And you've asked for examples to show that it's not, and this is what I'm saying, and I've given you two examples. The first concerns self-remembering. We come to the conclusion that we must remember ourselves, but we can remember ourselves only if we have in ourselves the energies for self-remembering. So it's not about self-remembering. The teaching on negative emotions. Gurdjieff says you can try to struggle with a habit. What is the habit? The habit is that we immediately express ourselves or manifest when we experience an unpleasant emotion. Nothing to do. It's a struggle with a habit, nothing to do with the emotions. So again and again, I've given two examples. You asked for examples. Two examples. The core of Ouspensky's teaching, the core of the Gurdjieff tradition, is just not what Gurdjieff is teaching.